Yay. So today's speaker is Dr. Nikki Weil. She is a research astrophysicist at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. And her expertise areas are solar, coronal, and solar wind physics. Nikki was the recipient of the Karen Harvey Prize in 2018, awarded by the Solar Physics Division of the American Astronomical Society. And also she is currently serving as the SPD Vice Chair. Nikki is the mission scientist for the PUNCH mission, which is a polarimeter to unify the coronal and heliosphere. And she currently serves on the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Committee on Solar and Space Physics. And with that, Nikki.
All right, it's all mine. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. This is, and thank you, Annie, for inviting me. This is so great to get to have these virtual seminars and get to be there, even though I'm still here at home. So let's see, I suppose Annie's going to moderate if there are any questions or anything, but otherwise I'll try and end about 10 to the hour so that there's time for questions at the end too.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. So yeah, mesoscale solar wind structures. I'm going to talk about solar wind, which is filled with structures, which we've known for a long time, but the mesoscale structures are, we sort of newly have instrumentation and modeling capability to really understand some of these mesoscale structures. So I'm going to talk about some of the new advances and how we think that that's related to coronal heating and what those structures do to the magnetosphere when they get to Earth. This, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about can be found in one of these 3 review papers that we recently published. We did one on outstanding questions in solar wind physics. We did one on the heating of the solar corona, and we did one on mesoscale structures in the solar wind, and actually a lot of white papers for the heliophysics decadal, which are public as well. So a lot of this material can be found in one of those sources. All right, so to begin with, to understand the solar wind, and in particular, not just the global scale solar wind, but the mesoscale structures within the solar wind, we have to understand from where on the sun did that solar wind originate. And I'm showing this Goes Suvi movie from Dan Seaton's Nature paper that came out about a year ago, just highlighting the complexity of the solar corona and how the how complex the connectivity is, both spatially and as a function of time. You can see all these dynamics going on here. So the solar wind formation is a 3-dimensional, time-dependent, cross-scale physics problem. And even on the days where there are no CMEs, there's still no such thing as a quiet day on the sun. And that affects how the solar wind is formed. All right, so to understand the solar wind, and again, in particular, these structures, these mesoscale structures within the solar wind, you have to understand the source region back at the sun and the coronal heating at those source regions. And again, what I mean is not just the global correlations between coronal heating and solar wind, which we've known for a long time, but at these smaller mesoscales, what's really going on there. Now, of course, the coronal heating problem, all I've done now is just move the problem in, because the coronal heating problem is itself hard because it is 3-dimensional, it's time dependent, and there's multi-scale feedback within the solar atmosphere. So here's a cartoon representation of the sun and how it forms the solar wind. The takeaway is that the sun produces a lot of different types of solar wind that have a lot of different characteristics. So what I'm showing here is a cartoon that has coronal hole plasma. Coronal holes are tenuous, less hot, darker in ultraviolet, and they're associated in general with faster solar wind. And then the heliospheric current sheet, where the 2 polarities of the sun meet, that is associated in general with slower wind. But those helmet streamers, which are associated with the current sheet, can come from active regions or quiet sun. And that's what this cartoon is meant to depict here, is that the hash marks are quiet sun, whereas active region is filling the streamer on the left with polka dotted plasma. The polka dot plasma from the active region is going to be hotter, it's going to be more dense, it's going to have a different first ionization potential, amount of elements with low first ionization potential, it's going to have different charge states than the streamer on the right that's only filled with quiet sun hash mark plasma. And so that's just a simple cartoon version of how the sun makes more than just a couple of types of solar wind. It makes actually a lot of different types of solar wind. And in this case, I'm showing how coronal heating plays a role in making these different types of solar wind. And likewise, even though this cartoon doesn't show it, those positive polarity active region on the periphery there, those field lines are usually going to be open to the heliosphere. And again, that active region periphery open field coronal hole is going to be heated in a different way than the polar coronal holes. And so again, the type of solar wind that gets produced is going to be different there. All right, so since I pushed the problem already all the way back into the corona, now we have to talk about what heats the corona. There's some sort of energy that gets released in the corona. We know ultimately that what's going on is there's the convective motions, and those stir up the field lines down in the photosphere, and those magnetic field lines that are rooted in the photosphere come up through the chromosphere and make it into the corona. And the ones that make it into the corona, they carry all that stress, that magnetic stress from the stirring. That magnetic stirring stress gets dissipated in one way or another, and that's coronal heating. But the energy release events are not directly observable with any current observations at any current resolution. Even the wonderful DKIST and High-C and solar orbiter images, even those are not anywhere near to the resolution needed to really capture these individual heating events. So we know they happen though, because the corona's hot and the events happen, and then there's this giant black box of processes that we don't measure well. And then later, after the plasma thermalizes and thermal conduction smooths out the gradients, the thermal gradients along the magnetic field, then we see this emitting plasma. And that's what I'm showing over here on the right, is one of the beautiful AIA images. I think this one is 171 angstroms, so a megakelvin. And what you're seeing here is the thermal emission, and it's actually at least several hundred seconds, if not longer, after that energy burst happened. It's after the plasma is sort of slowly cooling. And that giant black box happens because of a couple of things. One is that there's coupling between the corona through the transition region and the chromosphere. And so that coupling means that those different layers of the atmosphere are fundamentally coupled, and the energy and the thermal conduction and flows between them make the problem complex. Also, as I mentioned, the individual nanoflares or energy release events, even wave heating takes place in layers that are discrete in time and in space. So whether you prefer nanoflares or wave heating, and probably both are going on, still the energy release events are discrete and are at below current instrument resolution and sensitivity. And on top of that, when you're looking at the sun and you're looking through all of the structures in that atmosphere, you're going to see a lot of different structures along the line of sight. And so that complicates things even further. Thermal conduction rapidly smooths out any temperature gradients. So even though the energy is very localized at a particular spot, when it is deposited, it instantly gets spread out along that whole coronal loop, for example, or that whole coronal field line. And so any spatial information is rapidly wiped out. And so then by the time you see it in an AIA image, you just see that whole beautiful loop lit up. And you've lost the information about energy deposition. All right, so I'm going to give my very biased opinion on some potential paths forward, both short-term and long-term. based mostly on research that I've been collaborating with. Okay, the first one is that if you did have an imager that had very high spatial resolution and very high temperature, high temporal resolution, and caught, had a bandpass that was very hot temperature, so that you caught that plasma immediately after it was heated, before thermal conduction had time to wipe out the gradients, then we think you could capture at least the rate of energy deposition and the spatial scale of energy deposition. So this is a slide actually that Jim Klimchuk put together. On the left is a zoom in of just one AIA active region in 171, so about a megakelvin. And then call out from a bundle of loops there in that AIA image, and showing that we know that the coronal loops are comprised of substructure. We know that what we see as a loop and in the AIA image must have substructure within it. So that's what this that cartoon shows. And then the zoom in again on that one, a couple of those little magnetic flux tubes is what this movie on the right is going to show. So this is a simulation of what if we had an imager, say measuring 94 angstroms, iron 18 at about 8 megakelvin, and saw so that you could see the individual flux tubes, not individual loops, but individual flux tubes as they received that energy, as the energy was deposited in them. And when you capture the energy deposition at this high of a temperature, the plasma lives so short of a time at that hot temperature that you don't have the line of sight problem anymore. You actually can capture the individual flux tubes lighting up. So how could we do this? One idea is with a photon sieve, and there is a CubeSat being led right now. It's called Visors, that's demonstrating this particular concept. This movie was showing what if you could get down to 10 kilometers resolution, or 0.01 arc seconds resolution. So for context, SDO is 0.6 arc second pixels, so 1.2 arc seconds resolution. DKIST is 0.04, high C is 0.4. So this movie would be pushing way beyond current instrumentation. And in fact, one of the Mission Design Lab studies that came forward as part of the decadal was led by Doug Rabin, Coronal Microscale Observatory. It was to do just this: have a photon sieve on a forward spacecraft, use formation flying to really get the spatial resolution down to 0.01 arc seconds, so pixels, so that you could really see those individual nanoflares, those individual energy depositions go off. And then the idea was that that second spacecraft would also serve as a coronagraph external occulter. And because they were so far apart, you could get the baseline far enough that you could actually have your coronagraph get low enough down that you could see how the corona responded in a global sense to these sorts of events. What else do I want to say about this? So that would actually target both the coronal heating and also could target this related question of how the solar wind is formed. And the coronagraph they would fly, that they proposed to fly in this mission concept study, was the camera that flew on BITSI, which was a sounding rocket, and the camera that will fly on CODEX, which is a mission that has not yet flown but is going to fly on the International Space Station in 2024. And the cool thing about this camera is, even though it's white light, it has different filters that are temperature sensitive and velocity sensitive, or speed sensitive, so that you can, in addition to getting density, you can also get temperature and velocity and really understand the thermal energy and the kinetic energy going on in the surrounding corona. So that's one idea. What could we do today with what we have today? So this is a project that Will Barnes led, that I was involved with, where he said, given all the things we can measure today about coronal heating, what if we forward model different combinations of energy deposition events, different timescales, different magnitudes, different so different storage and release times of that energy deposition, and which coronal heating parameters best reproduce the observables that we do have today with AIA, for example. And the heating parameter that he targeted was heating frequency per flux tube. So this is how much and how frequently does a single flux tube get that energy, heat up, and then how long does it have to cool before it heats up again? So that's the frequency per flux tube. He used AIA, which just is this massive database now, to calculate the emission measure slope. So how much plasma is at each of the different temperature bins, and the peak temperature. And then we also computed time lags, which is just to watch the plasma evolve from a hot temperature to a medium temperature to a cooler temperature. Or maybe it doesn't reach that cooler temperature. Maybe it reheats before it gets there, in which case you know that plasma was reheated within that time scale. And he used random forest classification model to quantify which of these different heating models work there. So he built these models to reproduce this particular AIA active region here that I'm showing. And then he compared it to 12 hours of actual observed AIA data of this active region that took place, this active region that was in 2011. This active region is one of the flaring active regions, but this time period was before it flared. Okay, so here's just a snapshot of the active region that he built. He just took a skeleton magnetic field and then populated it with flux tubes being heated in these different ways. And the takeaway, I won't go into the details, but the takeaway is that with the random forest classifier, he was able to actually give a probability of how likely is it that this region, this location within the active region was heated with really high frequency nanoflares. So the energy deposition was really rapid and kept repeating, or really low frequency energy deposition events where a big heating event happened, the plasma slowly cooled down, then another big heating event happened, and the plasma slowly cooled down. And he was able to classify the probability. So that's what he's showing here. That's what the color code is how likely each of the scenarios is. And I think that's what's really promising about this, especially with the AIA data, because there's so much of it that he can really start plowing through different active regions. And the takeaway actually is that most of the active region is really heated by sort of these intermediate or higher frequency energy deposition events, kind of the order 100 to 1,000 seconds between heating events for individual flux tubes. So we can't answer what heats the corona yet, but we can at least narrow in on the time scale of heating in the active regions. Okay, onward. So that's a little bit of what we can say about how the corona is heated. We know a lot of things about how the corona is heated, though. Like I said, we know active regions are hotter, but then they evolve over time. They have complexity. There's spatial variations within the active regions. You can say the same thing about quiet sun and coronal holes. So that plasma that was heated in these in this way that produces discrete temperature variations and variations in space, even within these broad regions, all of that then impacts how the solar wind is ultimately made. And so we have to think about this coronal heating problem when we look at from where does the sun originate when it makes that solar wind. This is also a tricky bit. You can see in the image showing on the right that on the left EUV and on the right is white light during a total solar eclipse. You can see the complex connectivity between the low corona through the middle corona out into where it becomes the solar wind. Right now, the solar wind model capability that exists, the models that are used for mapping connectivity, equate coronal holes with static open field lines. And of course, all you have to do is look at one of those SUVI AIA movie, the SUVI movies, or coronagraph movies, and you can see that the connectivity is not static. It changes rapidly. And so static open field lines is the best we can do right now, but it's we know it's wrong. We know it's an approximation. And so right now, when we do these models looking back at the source, at the sun, and say, were we connected to this coronal hole? Or we connected to an active region? It requires a lot of human interpretation to understand that. So for example, the fact that they have static open field lines and static closed field lines means that they have no way, again, without these proxies and a human interpretation, to account for interchange reconnection between the open and closed fields, releasing the closed field plasma from the quiet sun, from the active regions. So you have to answer those questions about how much active region plasma is being contributed to the helmet streamer, how much quiet sun plasma is being contributed to the helmet streamer, how much interchange reconnection is contributing to the solar wind. You have to have a human involved in these model interpretations, and you have to have proxies, which they do, for the dynamics of these reconnection released solar wind. And right now they're using things like the SWEB, coronal hole boundary distance from the current sheet, heliospheric current sheet as proxies. But in the future, ideally, we would have time dynamic models that accurately captured this. Okay. Another point that I wanted to make is that the energization in the extended corona is different from coronal heating. And this is why, even though Parker is making amazing studies in situ about the upper corona and learning amazing things about the kinetic physics that's going on there, it still will not answer the coronal heating problem. So this, on the left, I'm showing a picture from Dan Seaton's decadal white paper that shows, it's just sort of a representation of the upper outer corona that we see with our space-based coronagraphs, and then EUV pasted underneath there, and then showing the typical observing gap. Of course, you know, with ground-based white light imagers, we can see that region in the middle, and now with the EUV being able to be extended outwards further, like with SUVI, you can fill that in a little bit. But there's still a historical observational gap there and time periods where we don't have great coverage there. That middle region there, that middle corona region, is crucial for this connectivity. It's where the field goes from mostly closed to mostly open. The field, you know, the coronal field low down, it's highly non-radial, it's extremely complex. When you get out into the high corona, it's largely radial magnetic field. The low corona is collisional. The high corona is collision-less. So that means any energy deposition, the plasma physics that involved, it's going to be different in those two regimes. You know, again, what Parker's seeing is really collision-less plasma physics, whereas what's happening in the low corona is collision-null plasma physics. And that is really important from the perspective of how the particles get energized and how they thermalize. The beta changes tremendously, the sound speed changes tremendously, the alphane speed changes tremendously, all over this region. And so this is, again, why it's really difficult but important to connect the low corona through the middle corona to the high corona, which then becomes the solar wind. Related to that, the fact that there are these closed fields low down and open fields higher up also has implications for the way energy, magnetic energy, can build up and dissipate. Namely, because closed fields where both ends are rooted back at the sun, because they have both ends rooted back at the sun, magnetic reconnection is probably playing a role more so in those closed fields and heating them than in the open fields, which are probably more prone to wave and turbulent heating. In fact, if you look at the energy required, active regions almost certainly have as their predominant mechanism magnetic reconnection as the energy release mechanism. Quiet sun is uncertain, but and then coronal holes is the converse, probably more energy deposition by waves and turbulence. And so it's especially important, not just for connecting the low corona to the high corona, but also when we're thinking about when the sun makes the solar wind through interchange reconnection, and it takes those closed fields, and either those closed fields open up because of like reconnection or anti-parallel reconnection, or because of interchange reconnection, open-closed at the open-closed boundary, releasing closed field plasma. All of a sudden, that plasma is going to find itself in a new environment, and a new physical environment. It was on this closed field experiencing one kind of heating, and then it's all of a sudden on this open field experiencing a different kind of physics and a different kind of heating. So it's especially when we're thinking about those dynamic processes, it's especially important to link this. Okay. Also, when we're thinking about interchange reconnection, creating structures out in the solar wind, it's important to remember that the mass released by reconnection in the solar wind is not necessarily, and probably not often, related to the energy released by the reconnection. That is to say, the reconnection could be explosive and not release very much mass. And conversely, you could have really sort of weak reconnection that at a separatrix that was really just wanted to reconnect anyway. Not much energy would be released, but you could have an enormous amount of mass released. And that, think about like low coronal jets and jetlets versus big helmet streamer loops. And so again, that matters because of the thermal state that plasma is on, and then the amount of energy that could be released. So here I'm just showing some examples of this. On the left, I'm showing some observations in SDO and IRIS of little jetlets, little teeny tiny bipoles in the coronal holes, having interchange reconnection and releasing a large amount of energy. But those loops are teeny tiny, not much mass is coming out with them. And then on the top, I've got a simulation by Peter Wiper showing these coronal jets and how they work. They have an enormous amount of energy associated with them for how small they are. Contrast that, on the bottom, I've got sort of these helmet streamer blobs that we know come out at the tips of helmet streamers. They're large, and some of them definitely seem to be formed at the tip. Some of them might be coming up the legs, but they're very large. And if you think about the amount of mass in a big helmet streamer that's, a whole solar radii tall or larger, that's a lot of mass that can be released. And they don't seem to have much energization associated with them. That was the classic Neil Shealy result, calling them leaves in a stream, because they don't have this burst of energy and come shooting out into the solar wind. They kind of just accelerate slowly and slowly reach this peak speed at about 30 solar radii, long after the reconnection event has taken place. And that's what the plot on the right shows, the blobs being the leaves in the stream. So the point is, if you compare like these helmet streamer loops that we know are undergoing reconnection and releasing plasma out into the wind versus these little jets, the loop height, and therefore, something about the mass that could be released with them, covers at least 2 orders of magnitude, sometimes even more. And so that's a very different type and amount of mass that can be released. And likewise, as I said, that reconnection driver is very different in those 2 different scenarios. And then there's a whole host of in-betweeny type of reconnection and interchange reconnection guide fields and amount of mass and plasma temperatures that could be involved and those sorts of things, spanning the gamut between these 2 extremes. All right. This is a Parker Solar Probe Whisper movie from Encounter 6, actually. They've got so many great movies now. Just really showing all of the structure that comes out of the solar wind. This is pretty low down. I think about 20 solar radii is kind of what you're looking at here. And you can see just all of the structure coming out of the sun. And what we argue is that this structure, you're looking at it right after it came out of the sun. And so it was created at the sun. And we've seen this also in stereo core 2 movies, stereo core 2 data, stereo high 1 data. And the whispered data is just able to show this at a much higher scale, much higher resolution. And in fact, sometimes these structures, when they come out, they're not just coming out randomly, they come out in trains of periodic density structures. That is important, both because of their formation mechanism. Why would the reconnection be periodic? At the current sheet, it might be periodic because of the tearing mode at the current sheet might be making periodicities. There are some theories about that. Lower down on some of the interchange reconnection sites, maybe it's driven reconnection, periodically driving it. So we're researching that further, but the fact that it's periodic has implications for where it came from. It also is important for when those structures get to the magnetosphere. And I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. So I'm just planting that seed for now. All right. This is a cartoon, another cartoon visualization, just meant to represent the types of different mesoscale structures. So I've been saying during this talk that the way the corona is heated and the way that it makes solar wind produces a plethora of different types of mesoscale structures. So we're talking about way smaller scale than the big like high speed stream, slow speed stream. We're talking about the substructure within that, but still much, much greater than the kinetic scale. So there's this many orders of magnitude between that sort of global solar wind and then the kinetic scales that is hugely understudied, both in terms of modeling and in terms of observations. Modeling wise, you can't capture both extremes at the same time. You can do an MHD model and capture the global physics, but then you can't get the kinetic physics, and you usually have to sacrifice, aspects of the connectivity down through the transition region and into the chromosphere. Likewise, you can get a simulation that really gets the kinetic physics right, but then you can't get the global physics. So that's what the bar on the right is meant to show, that just simulation-wise, it's not possible to capture all of the regimes simultaneously. So the mesoscales are kind of where we're missing right now. Observation, same thing. In situ, you can get really good detailed kinetic physics. And if you piece together enough of the in situ data, for example, at L1, we have 25 continuous years of data with wind, you can piece together some of the global patterns, but you can't tell the mesoscale structures with single spacecraft or even the couple that we have out there right now. Conversely, with the images, I mean, you could see with WSPR, you kind of can start to make that connection between the mesoscales and a little bit of the global, but it's still kind of a bit of a microscope. I will later talk about PUNCH, which is a mission that will be able to fill in a lot of this missing middle here in terms of observations. Then on the left, what I'm showing, I'm just describing several different types of phenomena that we know are sort of in this mesoscales, like the switchbacks that Parker found, clumps of switchbacks, which we used to call microstreams when Ulysses saw them, are the bigger ones, the collection of switchbacks that survive all the way out through the inner heliosphere. The periodic density structures that I just mentioned. And then at the really big scale, like our CMEs and SIRs and CIRs, those are the large scale things. And the thing about the mesoscales is there's this competition. We know some of them come from the sun, but we also know that turbulence and other evolution and route will create new ones and destroy some of them. So the solar wind at the mesoscales is a little bit of a mix of both. And we don't actually understand, one of the outstanding problems is we don't know sort of the competition between the structures that come from the sun versus the structures that develop en route. And the reason we don't know this is because of the missing observations and models in the middle, in this regime in the middle. We can't follow them in our images for long enough to be able to see. We don't have the modeling capability yet to model that. But of course, as I've been saying, the ones that come from the sun contain information about the sun. They're also important for turbulence. And the mesoscales are really important for space weather. They're not the big CMEs and the big SIRs, but they precondition the magnetosphere for how the magnetosphere is going to respond to those bigger space weather events. It's also the medium through which those bigger space weather events have to propagate. And you'll notice, if you were paying attention, and if you weren't, then now I'm calling it out, that the Earth's magnetosphere I've shown on here, even though the Earth's magnetosphere is not a solar wind structure, but I'm showing it here on purpose for scale, which is that the Earth's magnetosphere is, the whole magnetosphere is what we would call, is of the size scale that's equal to all of these mesoscales that are in the solar wind. So all of these mesoscales that we can't really observe well, that we can't simulate well, but we know are coming from the sun often, and we know advect out through the heliosphere. When they get to the magnetosphere, they're bigger than the magnetosphere, so they're going to be an important driver, sort of a daily driver of the magnetosphere. All right, and I mentioned this before, but PUNCH is one of the missions that is really going to be able to fill in that missing middle. I think I saw Craig pop up, but Craig could tell you all about this for hours and hours. And I know Sarah's there too and could tell you all about this, and Annie as well. So I'm just going to briefly mention that PUNCH is going to really help tackle this mesoscale problem. So what PUNCH is going to do, it's going to take white light images. Think of stereo, core 2, and the high ones, for example. But PUNCH is going to do it with a polarizer so that it can also get 3D information. And it's going to do it with much higher signal to noise ratio, much higher time resolution, and much higher spatial resolution. And so as a comparison, what I'm showing on the left is a zoom in of a core 2 deep field campaign that was run to sort of demonstrate the kinds of things PUNCH ought to be able to see. But if you look at where first of all, look at all that structure coming off of the sun, all of this mesoscale structure that was only revealed when they ran this deep field core 2 white light imaging campaign. And where it maps to, though, over on the right is that little teeny tiny little yellow rectangle. It's just a teeny tiny portion of space. And if you look at how stereo had the 3D view, it did have some 3D view, but PUNCH is really going to fill in the full 360 around the sun. It's going to fill in over the poles, and it's going to capture where high 1 and high 2 captured, but with better signal to noise ratio, better time resolution, better spatial resolution, and again, the polarizing capability that allows the third dimension. All right, that's what I wanted to say about that. All right, just to really hit the nail on the head, hammer home something about the Earth's magnetosphere in comparison to these mesoscale structures. What I'm showing here is that same movie, the core 2, with all the mesoscales coming off of the sun, structures and density, and I'm showing to scale the day side of Earth's magnetosphere. And so you can see that that little teeny tiny dot is the day side Earth's magnetosphere. And so you can see that even these structures that are small compared to the heliosphere are large compared to Earth's magnetosphere. And that's why, one of the reasons why we care about this. And I mentioned that one of the types of density structures that my research team has been studying are these ones that come off the sun and they're periodic. So these periodic mesoscale structures are important when they get to the Earth's magnetosphere. From the magnetosphere's perspective, they're dynamic pressure structures. And so they squeeze and then release the magnetosphere periodically. And that's important for ultra low frequency waves in the magnetosphere. They directly drive ultra low frequencies in the magnetosphere. And we've also observed that they have impacts on the radiation belt. In particular, we've seen them lead to losses in the radiation belts. And here's an event where we looked at a series of these periodic density structures, these mesoscale structures from the solar wind at L1, mapped them to Earth's magnetosphere, and saw that the exact same frequencies were being directly driven in Earth's magnetosphere as detected by the GOES satellites. And what this movie here that's lighting up with all the black and white dots is showing is where those structures were in the ground magnetometer stations, and whether those same frequencies were found in the ground magnetometer stations. So the point is, we had this quiet time, solar wind, no CMEs, no CIRs, nothing especially unusual about this solar wind. It was just regular old solar wind. And yet the solar wind had these dynamic pressure oscillations. There was sort of a larger scale one at 90 minutes. And then within each of the 90-minute ones, there were these kind of 1 to 2 to 3 millihertz oscillations within them. I'll play this movie again. And then what the maps on the bottom are showing, these are maps of ground magnetometer stations. Let's see, I can play it again. Oh, maybe I have to do this. Maybe it's frozen now. No, there it goes. Okay. So the green bar is showing the time period over which the FFTs were calculated, showing the higher frequencies, sort of 1 to 4 millihertz. And then the maps on the bottom are different bands of frequencies, ULF frequencies in the magnetosphere. And that when the black dots light up, that means those ground stations saw the exact same discrete frequency that we know came from the solar wind. And sometimes just a couple of them will light up. That means it probably found a field line resonance and it was just a little response. But sometimes you'll see all of them light up. Like right now, they all lit up. And that means the whole global magnetosphere responded and had this, this wave activity. And that's the kind of scenario where you expect radiation belt response. Again, loss is the one we've seen most of, but also possibly energization. And the cool thing, connecting it back to the sun, is that Samantha Wallace ran a WSA ADAPT model and mapped this event that we observed at L1 driving the magnetosphere. She mapped it back to the sun, back to the source region. These maps are complicated. So if you know what you're looking at, then you know what you're looking at. Otherwise, it'll take a whole PhD to understand them. But the bottom line is that the upper left shows, this is a Carrington map of the sun. So imagine you've unrolled the sun. And this is showing, let's see, the upper left, the colors show where open field regions of the solar wind is coming from. And so again, it can only map to open field regions. It can't tell you that that closed field right next door interchanged, reconnected, and opened up. So you just have to pay attention to how close it is to one of those closed field regions. The gray is closed, the colors are open. And then those black, and then on the bottom, the yellow lines show where we were connected to, because the solar wind doesn't come straight out, right? It has to, the magnetic field is highly non-radial in the low corona. And so you don't have to understand all of this map. The takeaway is that when Sam did this mapping back to the sun, what she found was the day where we saw all of this intense regular solar wind, but that drove all of this activity in the magnetosphere, we were connected to the active region indicated by the blue or the cyan arrow that I've got pointed to the upper right. We were connected to that active region. Then we crossed the heliospheric current sheet, and then we were connected to another active region. That active region didn't make those kinds of mesoscale structures. It made a different kind of solar wind. So again, just the general takeaway is that where we are connected to on the sun affects the type of solar wind that is created, which then affects the driving, just sort of this everyday driving of the magnetosphere 4 days later. So that's my first takeaway, is that even there's no such thing as a quiet day on the sun, even on its, even on its most quiescent time, even when there's no CMEs, still the sun is dynamic and creating all of these structures in the solar wind. It's highly complex, especially interchange reconnection is making, we think, a lot of these structures. And we think that that the coronal heating must be impacting that in some way, that the coronal heating is creating different types of solar wind structures. And then, as I demonstrated 4 days later, those structures drive dynamics in Earth's magnetosphere. It's not the big giant space weather that a CME will give you, but it is the sort of daily ground state of space weather, the constant bombardment, and it can affect the radiation belts. And it also probably affects the preconditioning of the state of the magnetosphere for the next big space weather event that comes. That's my first takeaway. My second takeaway is the coronal heating problem and the solar wind source and connectivity problem are related, and they're both hard. They're hard because it's three-dimensional, it's time-dependent. There's multi-scale feedback and multi-region feedback, right? You've got the chromosphere, the transition region, the low, middle, and upper corona, and the solar wind, and those all are connected. But it's important to invest in getting it right for a number of reasons. The first of which is the physics of stars, of other stars, astrophysics, the astrophysics connection. It's how stars lose their mass. It's how stars make their exospheres. So if we think about comparative, heliospheres compared to exospheres, an astrosphere, not exospheres, I should have said astrospheres. Astrospheres. Anyway, when we think about comparative astrospheres, we have the best measurements here. So, and we can really nail down some of the physics here. The other thing is, of course, these are fundamental physical processes, physics of reconnection, physics of energy storage and release, physics of ion neutral coupling, physics of wave turbulence, physics of wave particle interactions. And then, as I demonstrated, a lot of these solar wind structures are the ground state of space weather. It's the space weather on the day that it was just ambient solar wind, nothing going on. And yet there were still these lower level space weather events going on. And it affects the propagation and the eventual impact of the bigger space weather events. So I talked through some recent advances, some things that we can do now. And in particular, I think it's really some things that are really starting to be understood. The solar wind is created in a lot of different types of ways. There's no longer just the two solar wind types paradigm. There's really a lot of different ways that the solar wind gets made. And when the solar wind gets made in those different ways, it imprints different plasma signatures, different properties into the plasma. The energization in the extended corona is different than the energization in the low corona. And that's why Parker Solar Probe is so amazing, doing wonderful things. And it still won't answer the coronal heating problem low in the corona. Mass flux from reconnection may not be related to ever, but certainly not all the time, the energization that's associated with those reconnection events. So some possible steps forward that I talked about, it's really important to connect the micro through the meso to the whole global system. And I talked about how Punch is going to get to do that. And I also demonstrated, quickly flashed up how CMO, which was a mission put forward in the mission design studies, how that could help with that. Global coverage is really important. Those maps of connectivity that I discussed, when we want to map back to the solar corona, if we're only seeing one side of the sun, or if we're only seeing the ecliptic view of the sun, it's really difficult to get those maps right. It's really difficult to understand the global corona. And especially over the poles have, polar views have probably the most discovery space because we've never seen them before. The backside, for space weather, of course, we know when an active region erupts on the backside, that's really important, and how that affects the global state of the corona. Connecting the low to middle to upper corona is so crucial. It's the cross-scale coupling, and then it's also the cross-regional coupling between these different regions on the sun. And then I think, this is just, again, my very biased opinion, I think to really answer the coronal heating problem in the low corona and the low closed corona, you have to have in situ measurements like a Huygens probe at the sun. And of course, we have to have the modeling to go with all of these great new observations that we're going to have. And I'll conclude here and take questions.
Thank you very much for the interesting talk. And are there any questions for Nikki? And I'm looking both at the hands raised in the chat. Maurice?
Hi. Great talk, Nikki. Thank you very much. My question is with regards to, you mentioned the, I think it was a Barnes 2021 paper about, you're mainly talking about the importance of temporal scale and spatial scale with respect to like bundles of like magnetic field lines and things like that, and how even with the best upcoming instruments, we don't really have the sufficient resolution to really monitor that the heating processes within those flux tubes. So my question is, you mentioned that in that model, I think it was the Barnes paper, that you all sort of constrained the time scale, the heating time scale down to like 100 to 1,000 seconds. Was that compared at all with observations of any kind? Now, of course, you made the point of resolution scales aren't sufficient, but my question essentially is, even though you're focusing on solar wind, and you did mention that, you're not focusing on CMEs and things like that, but with like the Filipov and Kuchmy paper with respect to filament eruptions and how you can see, the absorption feature converts into an emission feature. And so you get where I'm going with this, at least with filament eruptions, there is a large sort of time scale between how and of course, this is not solar wind necessarily, but was the models that you were referring to, was that compared at all to like filament eruptions and how it converts from absorption features to emission features, and that being a heating timescale of some sort, or at least an upper limit on the timescale?
Yeah, so let me clarify, because I went through the Barnes result pretty quickly, and there's a lot of assumptions built into that. The first thing is, when I say the heating time scale, I don't mean the time to heat up, because that time is super rapid. I mean the time between heating events, which is much longer. So the heating itself, the deposition of heat, is rapid, much faster than we can observe. But in the spatial scales too, the spatial resolution is really where we get killed. But what we were measuring was the time between heating events. So you imagine a heating event happened, and the plasma, even though it receives the heat really rapidly, like maybe within a couple of seconds, the cooling, because of the thermal conduction timescales and because of the radiative timescales, the radiative loss timescales, takes a long time actually, especially through those AIA channels. They can live for 1,000 seconds as they're slowly cooling. But then if you see it all of a sudden brighten back up in a hot channel, it received new heat.
I see. Thanks. That definitely clarifies it a lot. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And then the next question is from Joan.
Hi, Nikki. Thank you. Really great talk. I'm wondering, these mesoscale size structures, roughly what percentage do they form of the mass in the slow solar wind? And is Parker able to shed some light on that as well?
That is an excellent question. So I talked about mesoscales in a general sense, and I also talked about the very specific research that I'm after, which is the periodic density structures. In terms of the periodic density structures, we get the best statistics actually with L1 measurements, because we have 3 decades almost of continuous measurements at L1. And from those measurements, we think they occur, the ones that come from the sun and make it to L1, of order 30% of the solar wind. We've attacked that in a couple of different ways now, and we're kind of coming to that as the answer for the periodic density structures. Mesoscales in general 100% of the solar wind. In a sense, you can't not have mesoscale structures, because the kind that I'm talking about that come straight from the sun, then they're there. The ones, if the sun made totally homogeneous wind, then the turbulence for sure would make new mesoscale structures. So sort of either way, just in a 100% of the solar wind has mesoscale structures. But which type is what we're trying to understand.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the next, Mike.
Hey, Nikki, wonderful talk. Apologies, I was a few minutes late, so maybe you covered this in the intro material that I missed. But in the comparison that you were showing of the mesoscale structures in the solar wind driving the ULF response in the magnetosphere, that's a fascinating topic from the magnetospheric perspective. But then the connection back through the adapt maps to the source in the sun. Is there really enough resolution in the adapt map to get to the variability in the sun to do a one-to-one correspondence like that? Or could it be more driven by the turbulence in the evolving solar wind? I just don't understand that well enough. So clarifying it would be helpful.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I didn't show this part, but the reason we know that those structures in that particular event and other events came from the sun is from composition. So actually the density alone could have been created through turbulence, and absolutely some of them are. But when we look at composition, so the amount of heavy elements and how those ratios change, so alpha to proton abundance ratios, or when we have ACE on, then sometimes we can look at the amount of low FIP elements. And Craig put a thing in the chat and it's distracted me. Anyway, so the composition is how we can tell when events came from the sun. So that's how we can tell that it came from the sun. And then we just say, given that this event came from the sun, where did it come from? And no, ADAPT cannot say this variability on a 60-minute time scale mapped to these two field lines. What it can say is that this day had those events within it, and that day came from this active region, as opposed to the day before it that didn't have those structures in it and came from the quiet sun region over there. So that's the level of we can do.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Appreciate it.
So we are running low on time, but there is one raised hand that I see from Craig.
Hi, Nikki. As always, wonderful presentation. Thank you. I'm just here to poke you a little bit and say we talk a lot about the density structures. In fact, you and I are working on a mission to track them, Punch, of course. I don't hear people talking as much about non-density correlated magnetic structures, which have come to the fore recently in the switchback controversy. Do you want to say anything about those?
I do want to say something about this. Thank you. Thank you, Craig. Yeah, of course, with Punch, with Whisper, with Core 2, with High 1, density is what we're seeing. So that's what we have. But of course, especially if you're talking about how mesoscales impact the magnetosphere, BZ is really important. And in fact, a lot of times when we see these density structures in situ, there are BZ, there are magnetic field variations that go with them. But there are also BZ variations in situ that occur on mesoscales, and we don't know where those come from, but they certainly exist. And BZ will turn south for like an hour in the ambient solar wind with nothing else around it, and then there'll be a little substorm. Where does that come from? We don't know, but that's definitely, again, the next frontier in terms of our modeling and observations that needs to be tackled. It was not a planted question, actually.
That was spontaneous, Michael.
Okay.
It's just that I suspect Craig and Nikki are in sync, in terms of, well, Punch. Yeah, we are running out of time, unfortunately, but that is an interesting discussion, and I want to thank Nikki again, and I want to thank the audience.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. This was great. And I know Annie has my email. So if you want to follow up or ask me any questions later, please feel free.
Yep. So thank you very much.